Just breathe. We're getting a clear picture.
Is everything okay?
Yes, the heartbeat is strong.
Thank you.
Billionaire CEO left pregnant wife with $5. 15 years later, his company needed her signature. The medical document hit the cold, Italian marble floor with a sharp, dismissive slap. Clara Montgomery did not flinch. She stood in the center of the sweeping, cavernous lobby of Roth Enterprises, her posture perfectly straight. Outside the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, a torrential rain lashed against the glass, reflecting the smeared neon bleed of the city. But inside, the air was utterly still. The sprawling room smelled of ozone, polished stone, and the heavy, suffocating scent of Julian's expensive cologne. "Pregnant," Julian whispered. The word dripped with an absolute, venomous disgust. He adjusted the cuffs of his $5,000 charcoal Brioni suit. He did not look at her as a husband looks at a wife. He looked at her the way a ruthless corporate raider looks at a terrible investment. Around them, the lobby was paralyzingly quiet. A dozen high-level executives and 3 broad-shouldered security guards stood at the perimeter, watching the execution of a marriage. "You actually planned this," Julian said, his voice echoing off the vaulted, gold-leafed ceiling. "You thought tying yourself to me with a child would secure your place in this building. In my world." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the stone. "You are nothing, Clara. You were a charity case I dressed in Dior to make presentable at galas. You are completely, utterly beneath me." Clara did not scream. She did not beg. She simply looked into the dark eyes of the man she had loved, watching the last remnants of his humanity dissolve into pure, status-obsessed arrogance. Her silence was a heavy, physical thing in the room. Julian hated her silence. It unnerved him in a way he could not articulate. He reached into his tailored pocket, his jaw tightening, and pulled out a leather Cartier wallet. He extracted a single, crumpled piece of paper currency. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it. The $5 bill fluttered through the air, drifting lazily down before settling on the pristine marble directly at the toe of Clara's modest heels. "There," Julian sneered, turning his broad back to her. "That is your severance. That is the exact, mathematically calculated worth of you and that parasite you are carrying. Take it, and never show your face in my city again." Clara looked down at the crumpled green paper. "Hi, my beautiful story family. Welcome home to Mr. James Stories. How is your heart doing today? Please, leave a heart in the comments below, just so I know you are here and safe with me. If no one has told you today, you are precious. May your struggles shrink in the face of hope, and may peace return to you." Let us set all that aside and dive into another story together. Now, back to the story. Clara looked down at the crumpled green paper resting on the freezing marble. She did not weep for the audience of executives watching her public humiliation. She slowly bent her knees, maintaining her perfect, quiet dignity, and picked up the $5 bill. The paper felt rough and worn against her skin. It was an insult designed to break her spirit, to crush her into the floorboards of his billion-dollar empire. Instead, as her fingers closed tightly around the money, a terrifying, absolute clarity washed over her. "Escort her out," Julian barked over his shoulder, already walking toward his private, biometric-locked elevator. "If she resists, call the police." The security guards moved in, but Clara raised a single, steady hand. They stopped instantly. Even in her lowest, most destitute moment, there was a quiet, unbreakable authority radiating from her that made the hardened guards hesitate. She turned on her heel and walked toward the massive revolving glass doors. She stepped out into the freezing downpour. She had no coat, no umbrella, and no phone. The icy rain instantly soaked through her thin blouse, plastering her hair to her cheeks and sending violent shivers down her spine. She stood on the wet concrete, the water pooling in her shoes, and looked back at the towering glass monolith of Roth Enterprises. Julian was standing high up in the warmth of his penthouse empire, believing he had just discarded a worthless liability. He thought he had won. But little did he know, the wrinkled $5 bill she had just slipped into her wet pocket would eventually, by the very ground he stood on. If he had looked more carefully at her expression before he turned away, he might have seen the devastating fire igniting in her eyes. He might have realized his fatal mistake. He did not look carefully. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her flat stomach, shielding her unborn child from the biting wind. A silent, unbreakable vow passed from her heart to the tiny life growing inside her. She would not just survive this brutal night. She would build an unstoppable kingdom from the ashes he had handed her. She turned her back on the illuminated skyscraper and walked alone into the dark, rain-slicked streets. The cold was tightening in her chest when a sharp, sudden pain ripped through her abdomen, forcing her to gasp for air and drop to her knees in the flooded gutter. The icy water of the flooded gutter soaked instantly through Clara's ruined skirt as a sharp, sudden pain ripped through her abdomen. She gasped, her breath pluming in the freezing air, and wrapped both arms instinctively around her stomach. The pain was blinding, a terrifying, physical warning from her own body. For a fraction of a second, the sheer, suffocating weight of Julian's betrayal threatened to crush her into the wet pavement. But as the freezing rain continued to fall, washing the last traces of Roth Enterprises from her skin, a different sensation bloomed in her chest. It was not panic. It was a cold, absolute resolve. She forced her eyes open. She could not stay here on the street. She could not lose this child. Gritting her teeth, Clara pushed herself up from the concrete. Her Italian leather heels, previously a symbol of her secure place in Julian's glittering world, were now heavy and waterlogged. She kicked them off, picking them up by the delicate ankle straps, and began to walk in her stocking feet. The rough concrete was brutal, biting into her soles with every step, but she did not stop. She moved like a phantom through the neon-lit shadows of the city's underbelly, far from the marble lobbies and penthouse suites she had known for the past 3 years. After what felt like hours of endless walking, the flickering, buzzing red neon sign of a rundown motel materialized through the relentless downpour. The lobby was a bleak, depressing box. It smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke, damp wool, and quiet desperation. Behind a sheet of scratched, bulletproof glass, a weary night clerk barely looked up from his faded magazine as Clara approached the counter. "No vacancies unless you have cash up front," the clerk muttered, his eyes briefly taking in her soaked hair and ruined clothes. Clara reached into her wet pocket. Her freezing fingers brushed the crumpled $5 bill Julian had thrown at her. She did not take it out. That money had a different purpose now. Instead, she placed her ruined, but authentic, Dior heels onto the scratched laminate counter. "These retail for $1,200, Clara said. Her voice was perfectly steady, betraying absolutely none of the agony radiating through her body. "They are water-damaged, but the Italian leather alone is worth more than a week in your best room. Give me a key for one night." The clerk stared at the shoes, recognizing the craftsmanship even through the water damage. Then, he looked up at the quiet, terrifying authority burning in Clara's eyes. He did not argue. He slid a heavy brass key beneath the glass partition. Julian thought he had destroyed her completely. He thought he had left her with nothing but a worthless piece of paper. But this decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Clara took the key and walked down the dimly lit outdoor corridor. The wind howled against the cheap, peeling pane of the doors. She found room number 4, pushed the key into the stiff lock, and stepped inside. The room was freezing, smelling of mildew and old dust, but it was dry. She locked the deadbolt behind her, leaning her forehead against the cheap wood, letting out a long, shaky breath. She had survived the night. She had secured a fortress, however small and fragile. But as she took a single step toward the sagging mattress, another agonizing spike of pain tore through her abdomen. It was vastly worse this time, sharp and unforgiving. Clara's vision went entirely black at the edges. She collapsed onto the worn, stained carpet, her hands desperately shielding her stomach as the darkness swallowed her whole. When Clara finally opened her eyes, the weak, gray light of dawn was filtering through the motel's broken plastic blinds. She was still lying on the thin carpet. Her body ached with a profound, terrifying stiffness, but as she pressed her trembling hands to her stomach, she felt no blood. The child was still there. She had made it through the longest, most brutal night of her life. Slowly, methodically, she pulled herself up from the floor. She stripped off the damp, ruined designer clothing that still carried the faint, nauseating scent of Julian's expensive cologne, and wrapped herself in the motel's thin, scratchy blanket. She needed a doctor immediately. She needed absolute certainty that the life growing inside her was safe before she could begin to plan her next move. An hour later, Clara sat under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent glare of a free community clinic. The waiting room was a sea of exhausted faces, coughing children, and the overwhelming, sterile scent of industrial bleach. It was a universe away from the private, concierge medical suites Julian frequented, where doctors offered sparkling water while taking blood pressure in leather chairs. Clara did not care. She sat perfectly still, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity that made the chaotic room seem to hush around her. Clara, a tired nurse finally called out from a doorway. In the cramped, windowless examination room, an older doctor with kind, exhausted eyes ran a portable ultrasound wand over her stomach. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy, until the faint, rhythmic whoosh-whoosh of a tiny heartbeat filled the air. Clara closed her eyes. A single tear, the very first she had shed since Julian threw that money at her feet, slipped quietly down her pale cheek. "The baby is safe," the doctor said softly, wiping the gel from her skin with a paper towel. "But your body is in severe distress. You are suffering from extreme shock and exhaustion. I do not know what you survived last night, but if you put yourself through that kind of physical and emotional trauma again, you will lose this pregnancy. You need rest. You need absolute stability." Clara sat up, pulling her makeshift blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked at the doctor, her expression hardening into something resembling polished steel. "That will not be a problem," she whispered, her voice carrying a chilling certainty. "No one will ever hurt us again." It was a silent, unbreakable vow. Meanwhile, across the city, the man who had caused this agony was making the biggest mistake of his entire life. Clara walked out of the examination room and back into the crowded waiting area. As she moved toward the exit, her eyes caught the flicker of an old, static-filled television mounted in the corner of the room. The local news channel was playing on mute, but the bold red banner crawling across the bottom of the screen arrested her instantly. Billionaire Julian Roth announced his engagement to shipping heiress Victoria Kensington. Clara stopped breathing. It had barely been 24 hours. He had not just discarded her in a fit of rage. He had orchestrated her removal for weeks to clear the stage for a more profitable alliance. The screen flashed to footage of Julian, smiling his arrogant, camera-ready smile, holding a glass of champagne beside a woman dripping in heavy Cartier diamonds. High above the sprawling city, in the lavish, multi-level penthouse suite of the Four Seasons, the air was thick with the scent of imported Cuban cigars and the delicate, buttery aroma of roasted truffles. Golden morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, triumphant shadows across the imported mahogany floors. Julian Roth stood at the head of a massive glass dining table, swirling a flute of vintage Dom Perignon. He was holding court. Around him sat his inner circle of executives, board members, and his new fiancée, Victoria. "It is simply a matter of pruning," Julian said smoothly, his voice carrying the effortless arrogance of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. He took a sip of his champagne, his dark eyes scanning the vast city skyline spread out beneath him. A successful empire cannot carry dead weight. Clara was an unfortunate charitable venture, a miscalculation on my part. Now, the board can rest easy knowing Roth Enterprises is formally aligned with the Kensington shipping fleet. A murmur of sycophantic laughter rippled through the room. They raised their crystal glasses to him, toasting his cruelty as if it were visionary leadership. Julian soaked it in, his chest swelling with pride. He felt invincible. He had shed a worthless wife, avoided the financial anchor of an unwanted child, and secured a merger that would elevate him to a kingmaker. "Now, to business," Julian announced, setting his glass down with a sharp clink. He gestured to his lead attorney, who slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the pristine glass table. It was the master supply chain contract, the cornerstone of his new, aggressive global expansion. It detailed the acquisition of a revolutionary tech patent, a proprietary system that would completely automate his international shipping fleet, cutting his overhead by millions. "The patent owners have agreed to the lease terms," the attorney said, his tone cautious, tapping a manicured finger against the thick parchment. "However, there is a minor transferability clause buried deep in Section 4. It stipulates that if the original patent creators are ever acquired by an anonymous third-party holding firm, the lease rights can be recalled instantly, without notice. We tried to negotiate it out, Julian, but they refused. Julian waved his hand dismissively, irritated by the interruption of his triumph. It is boilerplate garbage. No one is going to buy out a fringe tech startup, and even if they did, we will have outgrown the need for the patent in 5 years. Give me the pen. If he had looked more carefully at the paperwork in front of him, he might have turned back. He might have realized that tying his company's entire infrastructural survival to a single, vulnerable lease was corporate suicide. He would understand later. Much later, when it was already too late. He did not look carefully. Julian took his solid gold Mont Blanc fountain pen, unscrewed the cap, and signed his name with a heavy, flourishing stroke. He smiled, handing the document back to his lawyer. He believed he had just signed his permanent ascension to the billionaire class. He had no idea he had just signed his own execution warrant. He had left his throat entirely exposed, completely unaware that a woman in a free clinic, holding a crumpled $5 bill, was already preparing the blade. The heavy, brass-handled doors of the downtown municipal building felt like lead, but Clara Montgomery pushed through them with an unyielding grace. The cavernous hall inside smelled of floor wax, wet wool, and the slow, grinding machinery of bureaucracy. Her clothes were still damp from the freezing rain, her hair drying in stiff waves, but she walked with the posture of a queen inspecting her domain. She navigated the scuffed linoleum corridors until she found the dimly lit office of small business registration. The room was practically empty, save for a bored clerk mechanically stamping documents behind a smeared plexiglass window. Clara stepped up to the counter. She did not have the thousands of dollars required for a premium corporate retainer. She did not have a legal team or a boardroom. What she had was a brilliant, mathematical mind that Julian had routinely mocked as unnecessary for a wife, and a profound understanding of municipal tax loopholes. She requested the paperwork for a microentity registration, a heavily discounted, obscure classification designed for destitute applicants under a forgotten city ordinance. The filing fee was exactly $5. Clara reached into her pocket. She withdrew the crumpled, water-stained $5 bill Julian had thrown at her feet. She placed it on the scratched counter and, with slow, deliberate movements, smoothed out every wrinkle. She flattened the corners with the pads of her fingers, her face a mask of terrifying calm. Name of the entity, the clerk asked, not bothering to look up as he dragged the $5 bill into his cash drawer. Vanguard Meridian, Clara said softly. It was a name that meant nothing, connected to no one, and would be utterly invisible in the vast ocean of corporate registries. The clerk grunted, scribbling the name onto the ledger. He reached for his heavy, steel-handled stamp and brought it down on the registration certificate with a loud, echoing thud. He slid the stamped paper across the counter. Clara took it. It was a single, cheap piece of paper, but to her, it was the foundation stone of an empire. She said nothing. She did not need to. The silence she gave the room then was the most expensive thing she could have offered. As Clara turned away from the counter, holding her new corporate identity, she did not notice the sharp, calculating gaze of the older woman sitting on a wooden bench in the corner. The woman wore a vintage Chanel tweed suit and held a silver-tipped walking cane. She had watched the entire exchange, and in Clara's quiet, unbroken dignity, she recognized something incredibly rare. She recognized a predator waking up. The industrial shredders in the Human Resources Department of Roth Enterprises hummed with a violent, mechanical efficiency. Julian Roth stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, sipping a freshly poured espresso, listening to the satisfying report from his head of security. The purge was complete. Every photograph, every legal document, and every mention of Clara Montgomery had been systematically eradicated from the building. 3 mid-level executives who had dared to express a fleeting sympathy for her had been fired before breakfast, their severances revoked under aggressive non-disclosure agreements. "She is a ghost," Julian said, his voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction. "She was nothing when I found her, and she is nothing now. I want her name permanently scrubbed from the digital archives by noon." Little did he know, the erasure he had just ordered would be the exact mechanism that would destroy him. By completely disconnecting her from his life, he was providing her with the ultimate, impenetrable camouflage. The heavy oak doors to his office opened tentatively. His lead accountant, a nervous, balding man named Arthur, stepped inside clutching a leather-bound tablet. He was sweating, completely out of place in the aggressive, alpha male atmosphere of Julian's inner sanctum. "Mr. Roth," Arthur stammered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I apologize for the interruption, but I was running the preliminary stress tests on the new supply chain acquisition. There is a tiny anomaly, a fractional leak in our quarterly projections regarding the patent lease." Julian slowly turned away from the window, his dark eyes narrowing with immediate, suffocating irritation. He despised weakness, and he despised being questioned. "A fractional leak," Julian repeated, his tone mocking. "You are interrupting my morning to discuss pennies, Arthur? It is mathematically insignificant right now, sir," Arthur hurried to explain, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled up a complex spreadsheet. "But the way the transferability clause is structured, if an invisible holding company were to acquire the original patent, this leak could function as a backdoor to recall our infrastructure." Julian let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He walked over to Arthur, looming over the smaller man, the heavy scent of his expensive cologne filling the space between them. "You are looking at shadows, Arthur," Julian sneered. "No one has the capital to threaten Roth Enterprises. The company is invincible. This anomaly is worthless. Ignore it." Arthur swallowed hard, clutching his tablet. He nodded, backing out of the room, terrified to push the issue further. But as the heavy doors clicked shut, the accountant felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. Julian's absolute arrogance had blinded him, and Arthur realized with horrifying clarity that they had just left the gates to the city wide open. The air inside the small, unassuming diner across from the municipal building smelled of burnt coffee and cheap grease. It was empty, save for Clara, who sat in a vinyl booth staring at her single piece of registration paper. "May I sit down?" Clara looked up. Standing beside the booth was the older woman from the registry office. Up close, the woman radiated a terrifying, old-money authority. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her posture rigid, and the heavy diamond on her finger caught the flickering diner lights. "I prefer to sit alone," Clara said, her voice polite but completely guarded. The woman smiled, a sharp, carnivorous expression, and slid into the booth anyway. "My name is Eleanor Higgins. I spent 40 years liquidating weak companies on Wall Street before the men in those boardrooms even realized they were bleeding. I was sitting in the registry office because I own the building, and I like to see who is begging the city for scraps." Clara did not flinch. She met Eleanor's piercing gaze with absolute, unblinking calm. "You were not begging," Eleanor continued, leaning forward slightly, her expensive perfume cutting through the smell of the diner. "You registered a microentity. You used a $5 bill that looked like it had been through a war. Yet, you carry yourself like you own the block. Why Vanguard Meridian?" "Because it is mathematically invisible," Clara answered smoothly, her voice betraying zero intimidation. "The City Ordinance Tax Code 402B allows microentities to compound assets privately without triggering federal monopoly thresholds for exactly 15 years. It is a blind spot." Eleanor Higgins froze. The older woman's eyes widened slightly as she mentally ran the tax code Clara had just casually cited. It was an incredibly complex, brilliant strategy that required a genius-level understanding of corporate law. "Who did this to you?" Eleanor whispered, the predatory amusement vanishing from her face, replaced by genuine awe. "A man who believes I am worthless," Clara replied. Her tone was not bitter. It was cold, like a vault locking shut. Eleanor stared at the young, destitute, pregnant woman sitting across from her. She saw the iron spine, the shattered heart, and the brilliant, calculating mind. Eleanor reached into her vintage leather handbag, pulled out a sleek, embossed checkbook, and unscrewed a gold pen. He thought he had one, but if Julian had been standing in that diner, he would have realized his empire was already burning. Eleanor wrote out a string of numbers, signed her name with a sharp flourish, and slid the blank check across the sticky laminate table. "Consider this your seed capital, Vanguard Meridian," Eleanor said softly. "Do not disappoint me." The winter in the city was brutal, a relentless expanse of gray skies and biting winds that perfectly mirrored the coldness of Julian's world. But inside her modest, impeccably clean apartment, Clara Montgomery was building a fortress of warmth. She had not touched a single penny of Mrs. Higgins's seed capital for her own comfort. Every dollar was mathematically allocated, woven into the invisible, compounding web of Vanguard Meridian. She ate simple meals and wore unbranded, practical clothes. Her iron will focused entirely on the future. When her time finally came, there were no paparazzi, no private luxury suites, and no baccarat crystal vases filled with imported orchids. There was only the quiet, sterile hum of a community hospital maternity ward. The pain was blinding, a physical agony that threatened to tear her apart, but Clara did not scream. She endured the torment in absolute, terrifying silence. Her silence was a heavy, physical thing in the room, a testament to her unbreakable dignity. The nurses exchanged wide-eyed glances, awed by the sheer stoicism of the woman who gripped the bed rails until her knuckles turned white. Then, the silence was broken by the sharp, healthy cry of her newborn son. The exhausted doctor placed the small, warm weight onto Clara's chest. She looked down into the dark, profound eyes of her baby boy. She named him Leo. He had Julian's dark hair, but the calm, analytical depths of his eyes were entirely hers. As she pressed her lips to his soft forehead, the crushing weight of the past 9 months dissolved into a fierce, protective fire. Her love for him fueled the engine of her long-term plan. He was not a tool for revenge. He was her legacy. He was the proof that she had survived. A soft knock at the hospital door pulled her from her reverie. A courier, looking entirely out of place in the modest ward, stepped inside. He handed her a thick, embossed envelope sealed with a wax crest. It was from Mrs. Higgins's private broker. Clara opened it with one hand, cradling Leo with the other. Inside was a heavy parchment document, the first official stock certificate for Vanguard Meridian. The obscure LLC had successfully absorbed its first string of toxic corporate debt, liquidating it for a massive, invisible profit. The takeover had officially begun. She traced the raised ink of her shadow company's name. Julian thought he had won, but he would understand later. Much later, when it was already too late. He believed she was a worthless liability, shivering in the gutters of his city. He had no idea he had just financed his own destruction. The arrogance of empire is a blinding disease. For Julian Roth, the symptoms manifested in the sprawling, glass-walled boardroom of Roth Enterprises, high above the smog and noise of the city. He stood at the head of a massive mahogany table, flanked by a dozen terrified executives who hung onto his every word. "The Kensington merger has doubled our shipping fleet," Julian announced, his voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. He paced like a caged predator, completely addicted to the scent of his own power. "But manual oversight is bleeding our margins. We need complete automation, and we need it by the third quarter." His lead attorney, a man who had long ago traded his morals for a corner office, slid a sleek, silver laptop across the table. "The proprietary tech belongs to a boutique firm in Silicon Valley, sir. They have refused a direct buyout. They are holding onto the patent rights, but they have agreed to an exclusive 10-year operational lease." Julian sneered. "They are nothing. A group of glorified mechanics who do not understand the food chain. Bully them into the lease. I want that tech integrated into our mainframes by next month." "Sir," the attorney hesitated, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "The lease contains a highly aggressive transferability clause. If their firm is ever acquired by an anonymous third party, the lease can be instantly voided. Our entire global infrastructure would be paralyzed. Then make sure no one acquires them." Julian snapped, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. The sudden violence made the room flinch. "I am Julian Roth. I control the market weather in this city. No one is going to buy them out from under me. Execute the contract." It was the fatal flaw. He was building his flagship technology on land he did not own, assuming his sheer intimidation would keep the wolves at bay. If he had looked more carefully at her expression in that lobby months ago, he might have understood the danger of underestimating an opponent. If he had looked more carefully at the structural weakness of this deal, he might have turned back. He did not look carefully. He signed the authorization, leaving his throat entirely exposed. Hundreds of miles away, in the quiet, dim glow of her pristine apartment, Clara sat at a minimalist glass desk. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic breathing of baby Leo, asleep in his crib nearby. A cup of green tea steamed beside her laptop. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the encrypted financial filings of the Silicon Valley boutique firm. She was reading the exact lease agreement Julian had just bullied into existence. Mrs. Higgins had provided the backdoor access to the market data, but Clara was the one who spotted the blood in the water. She saw the transferability clause. She saw the absolute, staggering arrogance of a billionaire tying his company's survival to a single, vulnerable tether. Clara did not smile. She simply reached out, her elegant fingers flying across the keyboard, and began drafting the preliminary architecture to slowly, methodically buy up the debt of the boutique firm's investors. She was not going to attack Julian directly. She was going to buy the ground he stood on. The years began to blur into a terrifyingly disciplined rhythm of quiet conquest. Time is the ultimate weapon for those who know how to wield it, and Clara Montgomery was a master of the long game. She did not sleep much. While the rest of the city dreamed, Clara sat in the glow of multiple monitors, absorbing international tax laws, analyzing global supply chains, and expanding Vanguard Meridian from a mere piece of paper into a shadow leviathan. She operated entirely through encrypted proxies and high-level brokers, never once raising her voice, never once showing her face. Her wealth compounded with a vicious, mathematical certainty. She was an invisible titan, moving pieces across the global board with terrifying precision. And as the years passed, Leo grew into a sharp, observant child, deeply loved and fiercely protected in a home defined by warmth and unbreakable dignity. Meanwhile, across the city, he was making the biggest mistake of his entire life. Julian Roth was hosting the gala of the decade. The cavernous marble lobby of Roth Enterprises, the exact lobby where he had dropped a $5 bill at Clara's feet, was transformed into a glittering palace of excess. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light over the society elite, the air heavy with the scent of imported orchids and vintage Louis XIII cognac. Julian stood by the sweeping grand staircase, a bespoke tuxedo clinging to his broad shoulders. He held a crystal tumbler, laughing loudly with a group of international politicians. Roth Enterprises is a fortress, Julian boasted, taking a sip of the burning, amber liquid. We own the fleet, we own the tech, and we own the skyline. We are completely impenetrable. He believed every word. He believed his wealth shielded him from consequence. Hold on, because what happened next even I did not see coming. Miles away, in a sprawling, breathtaking penthouse suite that overlooked the glittering expanse of the city, Clara stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore a simple, flawless silk robe. The lights of Julian's gala were visible in the far distance, a tiny, glowing speck in the urban sprawl. Her private attorney, a brilliant and fiercely loyal man named Alistair, stepped quietly into the room. He carried a silver tray holding a single, heavily embossed leather folder. The final signatures are secured, madam, Alistair said, his tone laced with deep reverence. The commercial real estate debt for the Roth Enterprises headquarters has been entirely absorbed by Vanguard Meridian. As of midnight, you are his landlord. Clara turned from the window. Her face was a mask of serene, terrifying calm. She picked up her solid gold pen and signed the final line of the acquisition, legally owning the very marble floor where her dignity was once attacked. Little did he know, the quiet strokes of her pen were already drafting his corporate obituary. She said nothing. She did not need to. The trap was continuing to widen, invisible and deadly. Julian was celebrating his invincibility, completely oblivious that an unknown entity had just bought the building he was standing in. The heavy, embossed leather folder felt cool against Clara's fingertips. She traced the gold lettering of the deed, her face a mask of serene, terrifying calm. Alistair, her fiercely loyal private attorney, stood perfectly still in the dim, golden light of her penthouse, waiting for her next command. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled hum of the city traffic hundreds of feet below. Outside, a gentle rain washed the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the neon skyline into streaks of blurred color. The building is merely the board, Alistair, Clara said softly, her voice carrying the smooth, dangerous cadence of a queen positioning her knights. Now, we must secure the king. She handed the deed back to him. Alistair slid a secondary, much thicker file onto the pristine glass desk. It was the master projection, the intricate, 15-year financial snare designed to completely absorb the supply chains of Roth Enterprises. It required absolute secrecy. It required Vanguard Meridian to become a financial ghost, operating through a labyrinth of international shell companies, offshore trusts, and blind proxies. It was a brilliant, terrifying piece of financial engineering. Clara stood up, her silk robe brushing silently against the expensive hardwood floor, and walked down the wide hallway to the nursery. The room smelled of lavender and warm linen. Baby Leo was fast asleep in his bespoke cherrywood crib, his small hands curled into loose fists. He was breathing softly, entirely safe, entirely loved. Clara rested her hand against the polished wood of the crib, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The fierce, protective fire that had ignited in the freezing rain months ago had hardened into an indestructible diamond. She would not rush this. She would let Julian build his arrogant empire to the very clouds. She would let him become entirely dependent on his own perceived invincibility before she removed the foundation. Little did he know, the woman he had discarded was currently mapping the exact coordinates of his ruin. Clara returned to the living room, the city lights reflecting in her dark, calculating eyes. She sat back down at the glass desk, folding her hands perfectly in front of her. "File the petition," she whispered, her voice carrying a chilling certainty. Alistair nodded solemnly. He withdrew a final, single sheet of heavily watermarked parchment from his leather briefcase. It was a petition for a highly classified, legally sealed name change, combined with a total erasure of her civilian records under a secure federal privacy injunction. "Once you sign this, madam," Alistair warned gently, his tone laced with deep respect, "Clara Montgomery ceases to exist on any public or private registry. You will be entirely invisible. You will be a phantom in the system." Clara took her solid gold pen. She did not hesitate. The nib scratched smoothly against the thick parchment, sealing her fate and Julian's doom. She signed the document with a sharp, elegant flourish. The woman who had wept on the cold concrete was gone. In her place was a shadow leviathan, waiting in the deep. 5 years slipped through the hourglass like crushed diamonds. Time is a ruthless judge, and it had transformed Julian Roth into a man utterly consumed by his own myth. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk in the penthouse office of Roth Enterprises, swirling a heavy crystal glass of 50-year-old Macallan. The heavy, suffocating scent of his signature cologne filled the room, masking the stale, bitter reality of his personal life. His marriage to Victoria was a cold, transactional nightmare, a daily war of attrition between two massive egos who secretly despised each other. They lived in separate wings of their sprawling estate, smiling for the paparazzi while bleeding each other dry behind closed doors. He had wealth, he had magazine covers, but he possessed absolutely no peace. In a moment of arrogant, bitter boredom, Julian pressed the silver intercom button for his head of private security, a scarred, ruthless ex-military contractor named Griggs. "Griggs," Julian barked, adjusting the platinum Rolex on his wrist. "I want you to run a full background sweep on Clara Montgomery. Find out what Midwestern trailer park she ended up in. Dig through the welfare registries. I want pictures." He wanted to gloat. He needed the dopamine hit of seeing the woman he had broken living in squalor, to validate his own brutal choices and silence the tiny, persistent voice of doubt in his mind. 3 hours later, Griggs stood in the center of the lavish office, his face pale and uncharacteristically nervous. He handed Julian a completely empty manila folder. The thick, expensive paper mocked Julian's demand. "She doesn't exist, sir," Griggs said, his voice tight. "No tax records, no driver's license, no credit history, no death certificate. I ran it through federal databases, private banking sectors, and international facial recognition. The ghost is gone. It is as if she never walked the earth." Julian stared at the empty folder. A cold, sharp prickle of unease crawled up his spine. He hated mysteries. He hated things he could not control. He tossed the empty folder into the leather trash bin, forcing a cruel, dismissive laugh. "She probably died in a ditch," he sneered. If he had looked more carefully at his own security, he might have realized the ghost was already inside the machine. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the heavy London fog rolled over the River Thames, pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a towering high-rise in Mayfair. The sprawling corner office smelled of expensive Earl Grey tea, rain on hot concrete, and polished mahogany. An elegantly dressed woman in a bespoke, charcoal Italian silk suit sat at the head of a massive conference table. 7 terrified European logistics executives watched as she meticulously reviewed a multi-million-dollar acquisition contract. She remained veiled in shadow, leaning back in her leather chair. The men could only see her perfectly manicured hand, the subtle flash of a flawless diamond, and the terrifying, absolute silence she commanded. She said nothing. She did not need to. The silence she gave them then was the most expensive thing they had ever received. She picked up a solid gold pen, signed the name Vanguard Meridian onto the document, and slid it back across the table. The acquisition was complete. The invisible net was widening, pulling the world's supply chains under her quiet control. 10 years passed. A decade of relentless, compounded power. Roth Enterprises was no longer just a company. It was a global behemoth. Julian Roth's face was plastered across the financial networks, lauded as a visionary titan of industry. Yet, beneath the glittering, impenetrable armor of his extreme wealth, his empire was terrifyingly fragile. His entire global shipping fleet, the very blood pumping through the veins of his company, controlling millions of tons of international cargo, was entirely dependent on the Silicon Valley tech patent he had leased 10 years ago. The proprietary AI routing system was his golden goose, and he had built his heavy, magnificent castle squarely on top of it. Julian stood on the teak deck of his massive private yacht, anchored off the sun-drenched coast of Monaco. The blinding midday sun sparkled off the azure water. The air was thick with the smell of sea salt, expensive sunscreen, and rich Cuban cigars. He laughed loudly, holding a baccarat crystal flute of vintage champagne, surrounded by a court of sycophants, models, and politicians who hung onto his every arrogant word. "We are untouchable," Julian boasted, taking a long drag from his cigar and exhaling a thick cloud of smoke into the ocean breeze. "Roth Enterprises dictates the global market. We own the supply lines. We bend the economy to our will." Little did he know, the email his lawyers were about to receive would destroy him in 72 hours. Inside the yacht's luxurious, air-conditioned cabin, Julian's secure satellite phone began to ring. It was a jarring, frantic sound that cut through the soft jazz playing over the speakers. Julian casually walked inside, his leather loafers sinking into the plush white carpet, immensely irritated by the interruption. He pressed the receiver to his ear. "Speak," he commanded, his tone dripping with condescension. It was Arthur, his lead accountant, and the man was hyperventilating. "Mr. Roth," Arthur gasped, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "It's the Silicon Valley firm. The tech patent." "What about it, Arthur?" Julian snapped, his dark eyes narrowing. "Did they ask for a larger lease fee? Cut them a check and stop wasting my time. I am hosting the Minister of Finance." "No, sir," Arthur choked out, the sound of papers rustling violently in the background. "They don't own it anymore. Less than 20 minutes ago, the firm was subjected to a hostile, total buyout. They were swallowed whole." The crystal champagne flute in Julian's hand suddenly felt very heavy. The temperature in the cabin seemed to plummet, the air conditioning suddenly feeling like ice against his skin. "Swallowed by who?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating whisper. "An anonymous international holding firm," Arthur said, practically weeping. "Vanguard Meridian. Sir, the transferability clause has been triggered. Our lease is officially under review. They have the legal right to pull the plug on our entire global infrastructure by midnight." Julian Roth froze. The Cuban cigar slipped from his trembling fingers, falling onto the pristine white carpet and burning a black hole into the fabric. He would understand later. Much later, when it was already too late. He had left his throat entirely exposed, and the invisible predator in the dark had finally closed its jaws. The flight back from Monaco was a blur of frantic, encrypted phone calls and violently turbulent air. Julian Roth sat in the plush leather seat of his Gulfstream G650, staring at the polished mahogany table in front of him. The cabin smelled of ozone and stale fear. The twin engines roared with a deafening, hollow pitch that did nothing to drown out the silence of his sudden isolation. For 14 years, he had built an empire on the illusion of absolute invincibility. But now, The foundation was cracking violently beneath his custom Italian loafers. By the time he strode into the towering glass boardroom of Roth Enterprises, the atmosphere was suffocating. The room, usually a sanctuary of his unquestioned power, felt like a tomb. His board of directors, men and women who had spent a decade kissing his ring, sat in rigid, terrified silence. The scent of fear in the room was palpable, sharp and acidic, cutting right through the heavy musk of expensive colognes and floor wax. "The lease has been formally suspended," Arthur, the lead accountant, whispered. He looked as though he had not slept in days, his wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. "Vanguard Meridian has triggered the recall clause. They are holding our entire global routing system hostage. In 48 hours, our automated ships will stop dead in the water. We will hemorrhage billions." Julian slammed his fist against the marble table. "They cannot do this. We are Roth Enterprises. We will bury them in litigation until they bleed to death." "With what leverage, Julian?" An older board member snapped, his voice sharp and unforgiving. The sycophancy was gone, replaced instantly by the vicious instinct of self-preservation. "They own the patent. They own the ground we walk on. You signed a contract with a fatal flaw 14 years ago, and whoever is running Vanguard Meridian just exploited it perfectly." Julian stared at the older man, his jaw tight. He thought he had won the unwavering loyalty of these men, but he was painfully mistaken. The moment his armor cracked, they were ready to feed him to the wolves. "You have one option," the board member continued, sliding a single, embossed piece of paper across the cold marble. "Vanguard Meridian has agreed to a brief communication window. You will contact the anonymous CEO. You will secure their signature on a permanent rights transfer, regardless of the cost, or we will convene an emergency vote and oust you by Friday. You will leave this building with nothing." The threat hung in the heavy, air-conditioned air. Julian felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of his neck. His empire, his status, his entire identity was tied to this company. If he lost it, he was nothing. He retreated to his penthouse office, the massive room suddenly feeling like a prison cell. He poured a heavy glass of scotch, his hands trembling slightly, and sat behind his desk. The glow of his computer monitor illuminated his pale, desperate face. He opened his private, encrypted email server. He had to do something he had not done in 15 long years. He had to beg. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He typed and deleted. He offered them massive shares. He offered them board seats. He offered them a king's ransom in liquid capital. He drafted a message to the shadow entity that held his life in its hands, pleading for a private meeting at his upcoming shareholder gala. He stripped away his pride, paragraph by paragraph, until the email was a groveling, desperate plea for survival. With a heavy, trembling breath, Julian hit send. He stared at the screen, completely unaware of the monstrous irony of his situation. He was begging for his life from the very ghost he had created. 15 years is a lifetime. It is enough time for a mountain to erode, for a city to rise, and for a discarded, broken woman to forge herself into an unstoppable force of nature. In the breathtaking, multi-level penthouse suite of Vanguard Meridian's global headquarters, Clara Montgomery sat in absolute, terrifying stillness. The sprawling room was a masterpiece of understated luxury. It smelled of fresh jasmine, old money, and rain on hot concrete. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, godlike view of the glittering metropolis below, positioning her high above the very streets she had once wandered in freezing desperation. She wore a flawlessly tailored, charcoal Dior suit that whispered of unimaginable wealth and quiet authority. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant, severe style, framing a face that had not aged, but rather had sharpened into something carved from marble. The destitute girl shivering in the flooded gutter was a distant memory. She had become the storm itself. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a conqueror who had already won the war. In the adjoining wing of the penthouse, her son Leo was studying. He was a brilliant, grounded 15-year-old young man, possessing Julian's dark hair, but carrying Clara's quiet, analytical soul. He knew nothing of the cruelty of the man who sired him. Clara had protected his heart as fiercely as she had built her company, ensuring he was raised with love, honor, and an unshakable sense of dignity. He was the living, breathing proof that Julian had destroyed himself. On the massive, polished glass desk in front of Clara sat two objects. The first was her encrypted platinum laptop, glowing softly in the dim, golden light of the room. The second was a small, heavy silver frame. Inside the glass rested a single, crumpled, water-stained $5 bill. Clara reached out, her perfectly manicured fingers gently brushing the cold silver of the frame. She remembered the freezing rain. She remembered the blinding pain in her abdomen, the smell of the cheap motel, and the agonizing, suffocating weight of Julian's arrogance. She remembered the vow she had made to the child growing inside her. A soft chime echoed through the silent penthouse. Clara smoothly pulled her hand back and looked at the glowing screen of her laptop. The encrypted inbox of Vanguard Meridian CEO had received a new, high-priority message. The sender was Julian Roth. She opened the email. Her dark, analytical eyes scanned the desperate, groveling words. She read his pleas for a meeting, his frantic offers of capital, his terrifying realization that his entire empire was balancing on a knife's edge. He was begging the anonymous CEO to attend his shareholder gala, pleading for a chance to negotiate a signature that would save his legacy. Clara did not smile. A smile would have been petty, a fleeting emotion beneath the scale of her design. Instead, a profound, chilling calm washed over her. This decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. For 15 years, she had patiently, methodically woven this invisible net. She had sacrificed, she had learned, and she had built a financial leviathan in the shadows. She had done it all without ever raising her voice. The silence she gave him then, in that marble lobby 15 years ago, had been a promise. Now, she was finally ready to speak. Little did he know, the email she was about to send would destroy him in less than 72 hours. She rested her hands on the keyboard. She did not rush. She let the silence of the room wrap around her, savoring the profound gravity of this exact second in time. She did not write a lengthy reply. She did not negotiate. The most powerful characters speak the least, and Clara's power was absolute. She typed a single, devastatingly simple word. Approved. She hovered her finger over the trackpad. The entire 15-year journey, the millions of hours of grueling work, the silent, compounding vengeance, all distilled into this one, singular motion. With a soft, echoing click, Clara hit send. The trap, 15 years in the making, had just snapped shut. There was no escape now. The Phantom was coming to the gala, and she was bringing hell with her. The sharp, electronic chime of the incoming email sounded like a choir of angels to Julian Roth. He was pacing the length of his penthouse office, his tie loosened, his expensive bespoke suit wrinkled from hours of frantic, terrified waiting. He practically lunged at his mahogany desk, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he opened the message from Vanguard Meridian. There was no greeting. There was no formal letterhead. There was only one word glowing starkly against the white screen: approved. Julian let out a ragged, breathless laugh that bordered on hysteria. He slumped back into his heavy leather chair, running a trembling hand through his dark hair. The sheer, suffocating pressure that had been crushing his chest for the last 48 hours instantly evaporated, replaced by a massive, rushing surge of his trademark arrogance. I knew it, Julian whispered to the empty room, a cruel, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. Everyone has a price. Whoever this shadow CEO is, they just want to be courted. They want to sit at the high table. He poured himself another heavy measure of Macallan, the crystal glass catching the ambient light of the city below. He imagined the headlines. He imagined standing on stage, a titan of industry, securing the ultimate deal in front of his peers, his bitter wife, and the hungry press. He assumed he could walk into his own shareholder gala, flash his billion-dollar smile, and bully or charm this anonymous executive into signing the patent rights away. He would understand later. Much later, when it was already too late. He had no idea that he had not just invited a business partner into his home. He had invited his executioner. Griggs. Julian barked into his intercom, his voice returning to its usual, commanding boom. The Vanguard CEO is attending the gala. I want full red carpet protocol. I want the press notified that a major acquisition is being signed live on stage. We are going to make this a spectacle. He wanted witnesses to his triumph. He was entirely blind to the fact that he was setting the stage for his own public destruction. Meanwhile, across the city, The invisible hand of Vanguard Meridian began to close its grip. The rain battered against the tinted bulletproof glass of a heavily armored, custom Maybach, smearing the neon lights of the city into long, bleeding ribbons of color. The interior of the car smelled of rich leather and the subtle, sharp scent of jasmine perfume. Clara Montgomery sat in the back, perfectly still, looking at a secondary tablet. Alistair sat across from her, his face illuminated by the glow of his encrypted screen. She was not going to give Julian the dignity of a fair fight. She was going to suffocate him before he even stepped up to the podium. With a few precise, encrypted keystrokes, Clara authorized the next phase. Vanguard Meridian's automated financial protocols engaged. It was a surgical strike. The algorithms Clara had designed over the last decade moved with terrifying efficiency, exploiting the hidden vulnerabilities in his personal portfolios. They bypassed Roth Enterprises' main accounts and struck directly at Julian's highly leveraged, personal secondary assets. In a matter of seconds, shell companies called in massive, obscure debts. Private credit lines were abruptly severed. Margin calls were triggered on his offshore holdings. His elite country club memberships were revoked. His private hangar fees defaulted. Julian's empire looked completely intact from the outside, a glittering skyscraper standing tall in the night. But inside, the steel beams were turning to dust. Julian walked out of his office, adjusting his platinum Rolex, feeling completely untouchable. He pulled out his private black card to order a celebratory bottle of Louis XIII for his board members. He swiped the card through his private terminal. The machine beeped. A harsh, red light flashed across the small screen. Declined. Account frozen. Julian froze, staring at the screen as a cold, terrifying dread began to pool in his stomach. Meanwhile, across the city, he was making the biggest mistake of his entire life by underestimating the silence of the woman he had broken. Julian was panicking over a plastic card, completely unaware of the precise, elegant blade resting against his throat. In the quiet sanctuary of Vanguard Meridian's penthouse, the air was entirely different. It smelled of aged paper, polished mahogany, and the faint, comforting scent of rain. Clara stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, her posture perfectly straight, wrapped in a heavy, charcoal cashmere shawl. She watched the distant, frantic lights of the city traffic below, her heart beating with a steady, terrifying calm. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the study opened with a soft click. Leo stepped inside. At 15, he was already carrying himself with a quiet, observant grace. He wore a simple, unbranded sweater, his dark eyes, so reminiscent of the man who had abandoned them, scanning the room with Clara's signature analytical sharpness. He walked over to the glass desk, his hands resting lightly in his pockets. The financial networks are reporting massive instability in Roth Enterprises' secondary markets, Leo said softly, his voice steady. Is this the man, Mother? The one we are acquiring tomorrow night? Clara turned away from the window. She did not coddle her son with lies, nor did she poison him with bitter rage. She had raised him in an environment of absolute truth and unbreakable dignity. He is, Clara replied, moving gracefully toward the center of the room. Julian Roth is a man who built an empire on arrogance. He believes that wealth gives him the authority to discard human beings like broken machinery. Leo studied her face. Why did he do it? Why did he throw it all away? Because some men only understand the value of a thing when it is violently taken from them, Clara said, her tone devoid of malice but heavy with an iron certainty. He thought he had one, but he was merely borrowing time on an empty ledger. He built his kingdom on a foundation of cruelty, and cruelty is a devastatingly fragile architecture. She walked past her son and approached an antique, biometric safe embedded in the mahogany wall. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. The heavy steel door unlatched with a profound, echoing thud. Little did Julian know, the item she was retrieving would be the instrument of his public execution. Clara reached inside and pulled out a small, heavy silver frame. She turned back to Leo and placed it gently on the pristine glass desk. Inside the glass rested the perfectly preserved, crumpled, water-stained $5 bill. He gave us this as a severance, Clara whispered, her eyes locking onto the green paper. Tomorrow night, we are giving it back. The red light on the private credit terminal blinked with a mocking, rhythmic cruelty. Julian stared at the screen, his breathing shallow and rapid, his dark eyes wide with a terrifying, paralyzing disbelief. His black card, a limitless symbol of his absolute financial sovereignty, had been declined. The bartender at the executive lounge cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably under the heavy, suffocating silence. "Run it again," Julian commanded, his voice trembling slightly beneath its arrogant boom. "The machine is broken. I am Julian Roth. Run it again." But as he reached for his phone, it began to vibrate violently in his tailored pocket. It was a frantic, encrypted text from his private wealth manager. His secondary accounts, his offshore trusts, his personal credit lines, everything was flashing red. An invisible algorithm was bleeding his personal liquidity dry, freezing millions of dollars in a matter of seconds. He rushed out of the lounge, his $5,000 leather shoes echoing sharply against the marble corridor. He needed to get back to his estate. He needed to understand how the ground was vanishing beneath his feet. When he burst through the heavy mahogany doors of his sprawling mansion, the air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne and bitter resentment. His wife, Victoria, stood at the base of the sweeping grand staircase. She was dripping in heavy Cartier diamonds, wearing a flawless silk evening gown, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "My private banking concierge just called me, Julian." Victoria snapped, her voice carrying the icy, transactional fury of a woman who married for status. "They suspended my platinum accounts. They said your personal assets are under a federal freeze protocol. What have you done?" "It is a glitch," Julian lied, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. "A temporary hold by the board to secure the Vanguard Meridian merger. Everything will be restored after the gala tomorrow." Victoria sneered, looking at him with absolute, unconcealed disgust. "If my cards are not active by tomorrow evening, Julian, I will leave you. I will take half of whatever burning rubble is left of this company, and I will leave." She turned and walked up the stairs, leaving him entirely alone in the cavernous, echoing foyer. He thought he had won the ultimate prize in her, but he was surrounded by vultures. His secure earpiece buzzed. It was Griggs, his head of private security. "Mr. Roth," Griggs said, the man's usually stoic voice tight, with undeniable anxiety. "The anonymous CEO of Vanguard Meridian has just landed at the private airstrip. But sir, the tail numbers on their Gulfstream are heavily classified by the Department of Defense. We cannot track them. They are in the city, and they are completely invisible." The heavy, watermarked parchment of the preliminary contract felt like a physical weight in Julian's trembling hands. He sat in the suffocating silence of his penthouse office, the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, mocking his profound despair. The gala was exactly 10 hours away. His personal accounts were entirely frozen. His wife was packing her imported leather luggage, and his board of directors was circling him like sharks sensing blood in the water. His lead attorney, Arthur, stood completely still by the mahogany door, too terrified to speak. Julian read the terms of the Vanguard Meridian agreement, his eyes scanning the elegant, razor-sharp legal phrasing. There was no demand for a massive payout. There was no request for board seats. The anonymous CEO wanted something vastly more expensive. They wanted his pride. This is an execution," Julian whispered, the heavy scent of his expensive cologne souring with his own nervous sweat. "They are the terms of surrender, sir," Arthur replied softly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The contract stipulates that before Vanguard Meridian signs the patent transfer, you must stand at the podium tonight, on live broadcast, and read a pre-written statement." Julian looked at the attached addendum. The statement was a brutal, public admission of his own catastrophic failures. It forced him to declare that Roth Enterprises was entirely insolvent without Vanguard's mercy, confessing his aggressive, arrogant mismanagement to his shareholders, his peers, and the global press. "I will not do it," Julian hissed, slamming the contract onto the glass table. "I am a titan in this city. I will not stand on a stage and beg." If he had looked more carefully at the flawless, inescapable logic of the trap, he might have realized he was already begging. He would understand later. Much later, when it was already too late. "If you do not sign the preliminary agreement right now, sir," Arthur warned, his voice shaking, "Vanguard Meridian's legal team will officially trigger the recall at noon. The board will vote you out by 1 o'clock. You will be escorted out of this building by security, bankrupt and destitute. Julian stared at the golden Mont Blanc pin resting beside the contract. The silence in the room was deafening. He thought of his frozen accounts. He thought of the sheer, terrifying void of losing his status. With a ragged, humiliated breath, Julian reached for the pin. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely unscrew the cap. He pressed the gold nib to the thick parchment and signed his name, literally selling his pride to save his empty, crumbling empire. The golden hour light streaming through the penthouse windows did not bring Julian Roth any warmth. It only served to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the heavy, suffocating air of his office. He had signed the preliminary agreement, surrendering his pride to Vanguard Meridian. But Julian was a man who fundamentally did not understand how to lose. He refused to be led to the slaughterhouse without thrashing against the chains. He locked his office door and walked over to a secure, biometric wall safe, pulling out an untraceable burner phone. He dialed a scrambled international number. He was calling Vargas, a high-level corporate fixer who operated in the darkest, most illegal corners of global finance. Vargas was the man Julian used to bury scandals, blackmail rivals, and destroy lives without leaving a single paper trail. Vargas, Julian snapped the moment the line connected, his voice a low, frantic hiss. I need an extraction protocol. The anonymous CEO of Vanguard Meridian is in the city for my gala tonight. I need you to intercept their vehicle. I do not care what it costs. Bribe them, threaten them, or find whatever skeleton they are hiding and bring it to me before they reach the podium. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The only sound was the faint crackle of the encrypted connection. Did you hear me? Julian demanded, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His platinum Rolex felt unnaturally heavy on his wrist. I will wire $50 million into your offshore account right now. Just stop them from reaching that stage. I cannot do that, Mr. Roth, Vargas finally replied. His voice was entirely devoid of its usual mercenary edge. It sounded hollow, almost respectful of an unseen force. Julian gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. What do you mean you cannot do it? You work for me. I used to work for you, Vargas corrected softly. 6 months ago, my entire network was subjected to a blind, hostile acquisition. Every piece of leverage I owned, every operative, every digital footprint was absorbed by a shadow-holding firm. I was allowed to keep operating under the strict condition that I never accept another contract from Roth Enterprises. The burner phone slipped slightly in Julian's sweaty palm. Who? He breathed, the terrifying realization beginning to crush his chest. Little did he know, the invisible net had been drawn tight around his throat months before he even knew he was bleeding. They own me, Mr. Roth, Vargas whispered. Vanguard Meridian owns us all. You are completely surrounded. Do not fight them tonight. You will not survive it. The line went dead. Julian stood alone in his sprawling office, the dial tone buzzing in his ear like the flat line of his own empire. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sprawling city slick and reflective, glittering like scattered diamonds beneath the night sky. Inside the master dressing room of her penthouse, Clara Montgomery stood before a towering, floor-to-ceiling antique mirror. The room was perfectly silent, smelling faintly of jasmine and expensive Italian leather. She was not preparing for a gala. She was dressing for a coronation. She wore a bespoke, charcoal Dior suit. The tailoring was a masterpiece of architectural precision, understated but screaming of immense, generational wealth. It was not a dress designed to attract the male gaze. It was the armor of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. Her dark hair was swept up, elegant and severe, exposing the graceful, unbending line of her neck. She wore no heavy diamonds, no flashy accessories. True power never needed to shout. Alistair stood quietly in the doorway, holding a silver tray. Resting on the velvet surface was the small, heavy silver frame. Clara turned from the mirror. Her heart rate was perfectly steady. The frantic, terrified girl who had shivered in the flooded gutter 15 years ago was entirely gone, replaced by a sovereign of industry. She stepped toward Alistair, her leather heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. She reached out and took the silver frame, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass that protected the crumpled, water-stained $5 bill. It was the artifact of her lowest moment, the weapon Julian had used to try and destroy her dignity. She said nothing. She did not need to. The silence in the room was a heavy, sacred thing, a testament to the thousands of hours of grueling, invisible work that had led her to this exact precipice. She slipped the silver frame into the deep, tailored pocket of her Dior blazer. "The car is waiting downstairs, madam," Alistair said, his voice thick with profound respect. "The global press has assembled at Roth Enterprises. The board is seated. He is waiting." Clara nodded slowly. She walked out of the dressing room, the charcoal fabric of her suit catching the golden light of the penthouse. She descended the private elevator, her expression a mask of terrifying, absolute calm. She stepped out into the cool, damp night air. The heavily armored, custom Maybach was idling at the curb, its tinted windows completely impenetrable. The driver, a towering ex-military guard, opened the heavy rear door and bowed his head slightly. Clara stepped into the plush, leather interior of the vehicle. She looked out at the glittering skyline, her eyes finding the towering, illuminated monolith of Roth Enterprises in the distance. She gave the driver a single, deliberate nod. It is time. The cavernous, Italian marble lobby of Roth Enterprises, the exact lobby where Clara had once been escorted out like garbage, was unrecognizable. It had been transformed into a blinding, high-stakes theater of corporate power. Crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, unforgiving light over hundreds of the city's most elite figures. Politicians in tailored tuxedos rubbed shoulders with ruthless Wall Street hedge fund managers. The air was thick with the scent of roasted truffles, vintage champagne, and the sharp, electric hum of anticipation. Along the perimeter, dozens of journalists and camera crews were stationed behind velvet ropes, their lenses focused entirely on the raised, velvet-draped stage at the center of the room. Julian Roth stood at the podium. He wore a flawless Brioni tuxedo, but it felt like a straitjacket. Under the blinding glare of the stage lights, he was sweating profusely. A drop of cold perspiration slid down his spine, soaking into his expensive silk shirt. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edges of the wooden podium, trying desperately to project the image of an untouchable billionaire. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously across the sea of faces, searching for the executioner he had never met. Directly in front of the stage sat his board of directors. They were watching him with the cold, unblinking stares of vultures waiting for a wounded animal to finally collapse. Embedded in the podium was a sleek glass teleprompter, glowing with the humiliating, brutal confession he was legally contracted to read the moment the Vanguard CEO arrived. Victoria, his wife, stood off to the side, her face a mask of bitter fury. She had only stayed to see if the anonymous savior would actually sign the patent rights and unfreeze their wealth. If the deal fell through, Julian knew she would be in a private jet to Paris before midnight. He swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in the back of his throat. He checked his platinum Rolex. It was 1 minute to 8. If he had looked more carefully at his own past, he might have understood the poetic justice of this exact room. He would understand later, much later, when it was already too late. Suddenly, the low, murmuring roar of the gala began to die down. It did not happen all at once. It rippled from the back of the room forward, like a wave of cold air washing over the crowd. The journalists lowered their champagne flutes. The board members shifted in their seats. At the far end of the sprawling lobby, flanked by towering security guards, the massive, brass-handled double doors slowly began to swing open. The entire room fell dead, terrifyingly silent. Julian stared at the threshold, his breath catching in his throat, waiting for the ghost to finally step into the light. The heavy brass doors swung inward, revealing the storm that had finally arrived. Clara Montgomery stepped across the threshold. She did not burst into the room. She flowed into it with the inevitable, terrifying grace of a rising tide. The entire cavernous space, packed with billionaires, politicians, and the hungry press, fell into a profound, suffocating silence. She wore the charcoal Dior suit like armor. The tailoring was a masterpiece of architectural precision, framing her unbending posture. She looked exactly like the woman Julian had thrown onto the cold street 15 years ago, yet she was entirely transformed. The destitute girl was gone. In her place was a sovereign who had built an invisible empire in the dark. The crowd parted for her. They did not know who she was, but absolute power has a gravitational pull that cannot be ignored. Wall Street titans stepped back, lowering their eyes as she passed. The camera flashes began to pop, a blinding, staccato rhythm of white light illuminating the marble floors, but Clara did not blink. Her focus was absolute. She moved with the quiet, devastating elegance of a predator entering a cage. On the stage, Julian Roth stopped breathing. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His hands, gripping the wooden edges of the podium, began to tremble so violently that the microphone stand rattled against the wood. His mind violently rejected the impossible reality of the face he was seeing. It could not be her. The pregnant girl he had discarded like worthless garbage could not be the anonymous Leviathan holding the leash to his entire corporate infrastructure. It was a mathematical impossibility. It was a fever dream brought on by the crushing stress of the last 48 hours. But as she took another step closer, the cold, hard truth settled over him like a burial shroud. Little did he know, the nightmare he was experiencing was only just beginning. Clara walked down the center aisle. The scent of roasted truffles and vintage champagne was entirely overpowered by the sharp, electric smell of pure tension. She did not look up at him. She did not offer him a single glance of recognition, anger, or vindication. Her silence was a heavy, physical weapon, and it was tearing him apart from the inside out. He had expected an aggressive corporate raider. He had expected a brutal, loud negotiation. He had not expected the ghost of his own cruelty. Victoria, standing near the edge of the velvet-draped stage, noticed her husband's total physical collapse. She followed his terrified, wide-eyed stare to the elegant woman approaching the steps. Victoria did not know Clara, but she recognized the absolute, paralyzing terror radiating from the man she had married. Julian looked like a man watching his own executioner sharpen the blade. Clara reached the base of the stage stairs. The entire room held its collective breath. Every camera lens in the room was focused on her pristine silhouette. Julian's board members leaned forward in their plush seats, desperate to understand the dynamic shifting before their eyes. Julian felt the crushing weight of their stares, but he was entirely paralyzed. He was trapped in the gravity of the woman he had once called nothing. The wooden stairs groaned softly under Clara's Italian leather heels as she ascended to the stage. With every measured, deliberate step, the suffocating reality of his doom tightened around Julian's throat. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords were frozen. The man who had spent a decade dictating the global market weather, the arrogant bully who believed he was utterly untouchable, was now shivering under the blinding heat of the stage lights. He could feel the cold sweat soaking through the collar of his bespoke Brioni shirt. Clara stepped onto the platform. She was mere feet away from him now. Up close, Julian could see the utter lack of fear in her dark, analytical eyes. There was no rage. There was no petty vindictiveness. There was only a cold, vast emptiness where her love for him used to be. It terrified him vastly more than any screaming threat ever could. A screaming woman was someone he could dismiss as hysterical. A perfectly calm, silent woman holding his entire net worth in her hands was a monster he did not know how to fight. Julian's microphone picked up his ragged, trembling breath. The sound echoed through the massive ballroom, a pathetic, wet noise that made the board members in the front row exchange sharp, worried glances. "Clara," Julian whispered. The name slipped from his lips like a dying gasp, amplified across the cavernous lobby for hundreds of the most powerful people in the city to hear. A ripple of confusion swept through the elite crowd. The press leaned forward, their high-definition cameras recording every microscopic drop of sweat on Julian's pale forehead. If he had looked more carefully at her expression all those years ago, when she picked up that crumpled $5 bill, he might have seen this exact moment coming. He did not look carefully. Now, he was trapped in the blinding glare of his own consequences, standing before the architect of his ruin. Clara did not flinch at the sound of her name. She did not give him the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. She stepped up to the secondary microphone, her posture radiating an unbreakable, quiet dignity that made the room feel incredibly small. She looked out at the sea of faces, the board members, the politicians, the investors, commanding the room with absolute authority. Then, she slowly turned her head and looked Julian directly in the eyes. "I believe you need a signature, Mr. Roth," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly smooth, carrying effortlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. It was not the voice of a broken, destitute wife. It was the voice of Vanguard Meridian. It was the voice of the shadow-holding firm that owned his buildings, his ships, his debt, and his future. Julian's knees buckled slightly. He gripped the heavy wooden edges of the podium to keep from collapsing in front of the cameras. The terrifying truth crashed over him like a physical blow, shattering the last remnants of his ego. She had not just survived the rain. She had bought the sky above his head. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute it felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. Clara stood perfectly still, her presence dominating the massive space. She was waiting. Arthur, the terrified lead accountant, stepped forward from the shadows of the stage wing. His hands shook violently as he placed the heavy, watermarked master contract onto the podium, setting it right next to the glowing glass teleprompter. He scurried back into the dark, desperate to avoid the blast radius of the catastrophe that was unfolding. Julian looked down at the screen. The pre-written statement of his own absolute surrender was scrolling in bright, unforgiving letters. It was the addendum he had signed hours ago to secure her presence. He looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the world were staring at him. He looked at the flashing red lights of the press cameras broadcasting live to global financial networks. He looked back at Clara. She offered him nothing. She said nothing. She did not need to. He would understand later, when he was completely destroyed and entirely alone, that her silence in this moment was the heaviest verdict of all. "Read it, Julian." The chairman of his board barked from the front row, his voice cutting sharply through the unbearable tension. "Read the statement and secure the signature." Julian swallowed the bitter, acidic taste of total defeat. He leaned heavily over the microphone, using the podium to remain standing. Julian began, his voice cracking horribly. He cleared his throat, but the arrogant boom that had defined his career was gone forever. "I, Julian Roth, stand before you tonight to formally admit to the catastrophic mismanagement of Roth Enterprises." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the audience. The journalists started typing frantically, the sound of their keys like a swarm of locusts. Victoria's face contorted in absolute horror as the sheer, humiliating scale of her husband's collapse unfolded before her eyes. "Through my own gross negligence and arrogant infrastructural planning," Julian continued, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. Every syllable felt like chewing glass. "I have led this company into total insolvency. We are entirely dependent on the mercy of Vanguard Meridian to survive the night. I have failed my shareholders. I have failed this board. I have failed." Every word was a razor blade tearing at his ego. He was publicly dismantling the myth of his own greatness, confessing his profound weakness to the exact people he had spent a decade trying to impress. The destruction was complete, and it was entirely, devastatingly public. He had nowhere to hide. He finished reading, his dignity in absolute shreds. He looked like a hollow, broken shell of a man, stripped of everything but his custom suit. With a shaking, defeated hand, Julian pushed the thick master contract across the podium toward Clara. He picked up his solid gold Montblanc fountain pen and offered it to her. His dark eyes, swimming with tears of profound humiliation, pleaded with her to end the torture. He was begging for the signature that would allow him to keep a fraction of his life. The solid gold Montblanc fountain pen gleamed under the blinding glare of the stage lights. Julian held it out with a trembling, desperate hand. The man who had spent his entire adult life taking whatever he wanted, breaking whoever stood in his way, was now physically leaning on the wooden podium just to keep his knees from giving out completely. He was offering the pen to the anonymous CEO of Vanguard Meridian as if it were a white flag of total, unconditional surrender. He was offering it to Clara. The entire cavernous ballroom, packed with the most ruthless and powerful people in the city, was suspended in a paralyzing silence. The only sounds were the faint, high-pitched whine of the live broadcast cameras and the ragged, pathetic rhythm of Julian's breathing. Every eye in the room was fixed on the space between them. The board of directors held their collective breath, their fortunes entirely dependent on the movement of Clara's hand. Clara looked at the trembling pen. She did not snatch it. She did not smile with the petty vindictiveness of a lesser person. She moved with the slow, terrifying, inevitable grace of a queen who already owned the board. She reached out. Her flawlessly manicured fingers, steady and cool, closed around the heavy gold barrel of the pen. Julian let out a long, shuddering exhale, a microscopic fraction of the crushing tension leaving his shoulders. He believed, in his arrogant, desperate heart, that he had done enough. He had suffered the public humiliation. He had read the confession. He assumed that business was business, and that Vanguard Meridian was ultimately here to secure the multi-billion-dollar patent transfer. He thought the transaction was finally happening. He thought he was going to survive. Clara slowly lowered the gold nib toward the thick, watermarked parchment of the master contract. The camera lenses zoomed in tightly, broadcasting the exact moment of the signature to financial networks around the globe. The ink was a millimeter from the paper. Julian's eyes were practically begging her. "Sign it," his frantic expression pleaded. "Take the company. Take the board seats. Just let me keep my name." Clara stopped. The pen hovered motionless over the signature line. She looked up from the paper, her dark, analytical eyes locking directly onto Julian's terrified face. The destitute girl he had thrown into the freezing rain was gone. Looking back at him was the architect of his absolute destruction. With a slow, deliberate motion, Clara lifted the pen away from the document. She reached into the pocket of her tailored Dior blazer with her free hand, retrieved the heavy gold cap, and brought it to the pen. The sound that followed was small, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, it echoed like the slamming of a vault door. Click. She capped the pen. She was not going to sign. Julian stared at the capped pen, his mind violently short-circuiting. The breath caught in his throat, a sharp, suffocating gasp of pure terror. What are you doing?" he whispered, his voice completely broken. "I read the statement. I gave you everything you wanted. Sign the paper." Clara placed the gold pen down on the glass teleprompter. She did not look at him anymore. She turned her attention to the microphone, her posture radiating an ironclad, unbreakable dignity. When she spoke, her voice was a soft, smooth cadence that carried the terrifying weight of absolute authority. 15 years ago, Clara began, her words flowing out over the massive, stunned audience. A man stood in this exact marble lobby. He stood at the pinnacle of his own perceived greatness, surrounded by executives who fed his arrogance. And in this lobby, he looked at his pregnant wife, a woman he deemed mathematically worthless, and he threw her into a freezing rainstorm to clear the stage for his own ambition. A shockwave ripped through the ballroom. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, chaotic frenzy. Victoria, standing in the wings, went entirely rigid, the blood draining from her face as she finally understood exactly who the CEO of Vanguard Meridian really was. He erased her from his digital archives. Clara continued, her voice perfectly steady, slicing through the rising murmurs of the crowd. He believed that power granted him the right to discard human beings without consequence. But he made a fatal miscalculation. He left her with a single $5 bill as severance. Julian gripped his hair, his eyes wide, a low, animalistic sound of pure panic escaping his chest. "Stop," he choked out, reaching toward the microphone. "Turn the cameras off. Cut the feed." But the security guards did not move. They no longer worked for him. Vanguard Meridian owned the building. Vanguard Meridian owned the payroll. "That $5, Clara said, her dark eyes scanning the terrified faces of the board members, was the exact seed capital used to register an invisible microentity named Vanguard Meridian. Over the next 15 years, that entity systematically, quietly, and entirely legally absorbed the toxic debt of this empire. We bought your supply chains. We bought your corporate real estate. We bought the ground beneath your feet." As the sheer, incomprehensible scale of her vengeance washed over the room, a terrifying, synchronized sound began to fill the ballroom. Buzz, buzz, buzz. It was the sound of 100 cell phones vibrating simultaneously. The board of directors, the hedge fund managers, the elite investors, they were all receiving the exact same automated alert from the global financial networks. The Vanguard Meridian trap had officially snapped shut. The chairman of the board pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket. His face contorted into a mask of absolute horror as he read the notification. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the Italian marble. "My God! The chairman breathed, looking from the screen to the ruined man on the stage. It's gone. Everything is gone. Julian spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. What? What is gone? Clara leaned closer to the microphone. She was ready to deliver the final, lethal blow. She was ready to legally execute the monster. As the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of Vanguard Meridian, Clara announced, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. I formally deny the signature on the patent transfer agreement. Furthermore, acting upon the transferability clause triggered at noon today, I am executing the immediate, total liquidation of Roth Enterprises. Chaos erupted. The press broke the velvet ropes, shouting questions, their cameras practically shoved against the edge of the stage. The board members were screaming at each other, their fortunes evaporating into thin air in real time. The global routing systems are permanently recalled, Clara stated calmly over the absolute pandemonium. All remaining liquid assets are hereby legally seized to cover the defaulted secondary debt of Julian Roth. This company does not exist anymore. It is completely, mathematically bankrupt. It was over. The empire was dust. Julian's legs finally gave out. The titan of industry, the man who had mocked her memory and believed himself a god among men, collapsed. He dropped to his knees on the velvet-draped stage, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as he wept openly, a pathetic, sobbing mess of a man destroyed by his own hubris. Through his blurry, tear-filled vision, he looked toward the wings of the stage. He saw his wife, Victoria. She did not look at him with pity. She looked at him with the cold, calculating disgust of a terrible investment. Without a single word, she turned her back on him, walking out the side door into the night, abandoning him precisely when he had nothing left to offer. Just as he had once abandoned Clara. The noise in the ballroom was deafening, a chaotic symphony of financial ruin and desperate, shouting reporters. But for Julian, the world had narrowed down to the agonizing, suffocating reality of the woman standing above him. He was kneeling on the floorboards of his own shattered kingdom, staring up at the immaculate, unbending figure of Clara Montgomery. He had lost his company. He had lost his wealth. He had lost his status, his wife, and his entire identity. He was completely, utterly hollowed out. Clara looked down at the weeping man. There was no joy in her heart, no triumphant gloating. There was only a profound, peaceful closure. The wound he had inflicted 15 years ago was finally, permanently healed. She reached into the deep pocket of her charcoal Dior blazer. Her fingers closed around the smooth, cool metal of the object she had brought with her. Slowly, gracefully, she crouched down so that she was eye level with the broken billionaire. The camera flashes illuminated her serene, beautiful face. She placed the object onto the polished wood of the podium and elegantly, deliberately, slid it across the surface until it rested inches from Julian's trembling hands. Julian choked on a sob and forced his eyes to focus on the item. It was a small, heavy, antique silver frame. He stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing through the blinding panic. He looked closer. Pressed behind the flawless glass of the frame was a single piece of paper currency. It was wrinkled, water-stained, and deeply faded by time, but the denomination was unmistakable. It was a $5 bill. The memory hit him with the force of a freight train. The marble lobby, the rain outside, the absolute, venomous disgust in his own voice as he flicked that exact piece of paper at the feet of a pregnant woman, calculating the precise worth of her life. That is your severance, his own voice echoed in his memory, a ghost returning to drag him to hell. Take it, and never show your face in my city again. Julian let out a guttural, agonizing scream of pure, spiritual devastation. He reached for the frame, his hands shaking violently, realizing that his entire multi-billion-dollar empire, his entire legacy, had been bought, dismantled, and destroyed by the very garbage he had thrown away. Clara stood up. She had delivered the severance. The heavy, imposing figures of Vanguard Meridian's private security team stepped onto the stage. They did not touch Clara. They moved past her, circling the weeping, broken man on the floor. Mr. Roth, the lead guard said, his voice entirely devoid of respect. You are trespassing on private property. It is time to leave. Julian could not walk. He was hauled to his feet by the security team, his bespoke tuxedo wrinkled and soaked in sweat. the silver frame clutched desperately to his chest like a life preserver. The cameras captured every second of his absolute ruin as he was escorted out of his own building, dragged through the sweeping marble lobby, and thrown out into the damp, cold night air. He had nothing. He was nothing. Clara did not watch him leave. She turned away from the chaos, ignoring the frantic shouts of the journalists begging for a statement. She walked down the stage stairs with the same terrifying, inevitable grace with which she had arrived. The crowd parted for her once more, but this time, it was not just out of shock. It was out of absolute, profound reverence. They were witnessing a legend in the making. She walked through the massive brass doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. The heavily armored Maybach was idling at the curb, the door already open. Clara stepped into the warm, quiet interior of the car. Sitting in the back seat, illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights, was Leo. He looked at his mother, his dark, analytical eyes reflecting a deep, unshakable pride. "Is it done?" Leo asked softly. Clara settled into the plush leather, her heart rate perfectly steady, her soul finally at rest. She looked at the brilliant, compassionate young man she had raised from the ashes of a $5 bill. "It is done," Clara smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached all the way to her eyes. "We are going home." The heavy door closed with a solid, comforting thud. The Maybach pulled away from the curb, leaving the ruined, chaotic monolith of Roth Enterprises behind, and drove smoothly into the glittering, golden lights of the city. Well, my beautiful story family, that brings us to the end of tonight's journey. I hope you felt the profound, poetic justice in Clara's silence. True power doesn't need to scream, does it? It just needs patience, a brilliant mind, and the unbreakable will of a mother protecting her child. If Clara's journey inspired you tonight, please leave the word unbreakable in the comments below, just so I know you stayed with me until the very end. Please, remember to drink a glass of water, rest your mind, and know that you are deeply valued. Until next time, stay safe and keep your heart open. Goodbye for now.